This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
You know, Bonaventure, this 13th century medieval theologian, had a both profound insight, we might say, into the theological intuitions of Francis of Assisi, but at the same time he was also a trained theologian from the University of Paris, and therefore trained in the tradition known as Neoplatonism. Largely, he was influenced by the theology of Augustine. That being said, one of the central theological ideas in Bonaventure that has struck me is his notion of the humility of God. This word humility, first of all, it's not one I think we normally associate with God. We don't think of God normally as being humble. But the word humility in its Latin root means earth or clay, a groundedness. In a sense, a humble person is, we can think of a humble person as somewhat demure, kind of obscure, you know, doesn't want to be seen, the kind who's maybe the introvert. In our Western culture, we don't really value humility as a high priority because we sometimes associate it with lowliness, the marginalized, the humble, the poor. And yet that is, as I look at Bonaventure's theology, that's the type of God that he holds out for us. Not a God who is a benevolent dictator, so to speak, or an autocratic ruler, but a God who is humble. In one of his sermons on the Nativity, he writes, "God humbly bends down to lift the dust of our nature into unity with his own person." So the God who bends down in love to embrace us is a humble God. And I'd like to begin to explore this with you. To do that, I want to look at the notion, well, how is it that we can talk about God as humble, and the importance of this for us today. Specifically, in terms of the universe in which we live, a universe that we know is evolutionary, marked by chance, uncertainty. The world in which we live, a world of suffering and violence, and a world of plurality and difference. So I want to look at those three areas: evolution, suffering, and plurality in light of the humility of God. And then I want to ask, how do we come to know a humble God? And what does this mean for us as Christian and Franciscan to live in relationship to a God of humble love. First of all, what is the basis of God's humility? I think to understand the ground or the basis of divine humility is to look at Bonaventure's notion of the Trinity, because that's where it all begins, so to speak. The humility of God for Bonaventure is rooted in the very nature of God as self-diffusive goodness, or love. The highest good is love. Now, just to spend a little bit of time with this idea, Bonaventure says that in the Old Testament, the name of God is being. That's how God revealed God's self to Moses in the burning bush. I am who I am. But, Bonaventure says, in the New Testament, God reveals God's self as good. So we read in the chapter of Luke, no one is good but God alone. So Bonaventure takes the name of good as the disclosure of God, who God is, good. And he works with that. He says, first of all, good, to be good, you can't be all by yourself, you know. Good by its very nature is a sharing something of goodness. How do we know you're good? Because we experience that in you. It's shared. There's something of you that's communicated. So goodness is communicative. Goodness pours itself out. And that is basically what the Father is for Bonaventure. The Father is what he calls the plenitudo fontalis, the fountain fullness of goodness. Fountain fullness, I mean just overflowing, infinite fecundity of goodness. And that goodness of the Father is diffusive. You know, and I always like to picture, I think Andre last night spoke of the image of Niagara Falls. It's a good image to think of diffusiveness, overflowing. And this diffusiveness of the Father is expressed in one other than the Father, and that is the Son. The Son, the Word, the second person of the Trinity, is, we might say, that which is the diffusive goodness of the Father by nature. You know, the very nature of the Father is to give itself away, give this goodness away, and that expressiveness of the Father is the Son. As Word, the Son expresses everything the Father is in one other than the Father. And as image, the second person reflects, you might say, images the Father, a perfect imitation of the Father's goodness. So, the nature of the Father to be turned toward an other by the nature of self-diffusive goodness underlies the humility of God. So the Father is humble simply by being turned by nature of the good toward the other. We might say that God is, in the eternal life of God, other-centered, relational. All that the Father is given by way of expression to the Son. So that means because the Son, the Word, expresses everything the Father is, the Word expresses, you might say, the humility of God when that Word becomes flesh. And that love between the Father and the Son is the Spirit. The Spirit is this bond or nexus of love in the eternal loving relationship of the Father and the Son. The Spirit is God's freedom to love. The Spirit is generated per modum voluntatis, by the nature of the Father's will. So here's the mystery of God. We're getting into the mystery of Bonaventure's God. A God who is infinite goodness, a goodness which shares itself in infinite life, in a communion and a community of love. Both a love that is necessary because it's the very nature of God to love, and a love that is free. God's desire to love. What this means, essentially, is that God is not an isolated, autonomous, independent, self-thinking, thought, unmoved mover, but rather God is outward moving, other-centered, self-communicative love. That's the God we are called to be in relationship, whose life is marked by personal gift. The key to Bonaventure's notion of divine humility lies, you might say, in the relationship between the Father and the Son. Again, because it's that turning of the Father toward the Son in the expression of goodness. Bonaventure looked to the incarnation, not in abstract terms, but as the revelation of a peculiarly Christian understanding of God. The incarnation is that expression of the Word and the expression of the Father in the Word. So you might say it's in the incarnation that we come to know who God is. The incarnation reveals who God is for us. So in the Son, Bonaventure sees, who is poor and humble, is revealed the mystery of God, whose love is a humble love. In other words, I always think, well, did Jesus have to be born in humble, poor circumstances? Couldn't he have found a Holiday Inn someplace? Or, couldn't this have happened in another time, in another way? Maybe living in a suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. I don't know. And really what Bonaventure's saying is it's the circumstances of Jesus' life, you might say, reveal to us something about God. God expresses God's self in history in a particular way because he reveals to us who God is, humble love. So the life of Jesus in the concrete form of poverty and humility is a manifestation of God as love. Now, let's to try to bring this into a better focus. In his Breviloquium, that little summa of theology, Bonaventure writes at one point that we are to consider God altissime et piissime. I love that. Altissime et piissime. Most high, most exaltingly, et piissime, most intimately related to us, like piety, pietas, most lovingly embracing us. Now here's the key, all right? It's altissime et piissime, most high and most intimately related to us. Here's one of the key aspects of Bonaventure's thoughts, which we've already mentioned, the coincidence of opposites. The mystery of God is such that God is infinite love and intimately united to us at the same time. Now, Francis himself grasps something of this in his letter to the order. If you remember that passage in the letter to the order where he says, "O sublime humility, O humble sublimity." Sublime humility, humble sublimity. That's the mystery of God here. I was trying to think of an image that could help us grasp or understand this mystery of God as humble love. And I don't know why, it must be a midlife crisis, but I thought of a baby crib. And I remember when I have a few nieces and nephews, and my nephew David in particular was a delightful baby. 6 months old, he would sit there in the crib and all smiles, just sitting there. And I would reach down into the crib, to lift him up. And I thought to myself, isn't that what we're really kind of saying here about God? God, you might say, the source of life, is like that parent who reaches down, into the crib. And yet God is also the babe in the crib. God is altissime, et pissime. God is most high, most intimately related to us. So we can think of the humility of God as God in the baby crib of the universe. God, both infinite in love and hidden in the smallest things of creation. We see the humility of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And Bonaventure looked again at the history of Jesus as the embodiment of the divine word in created reality. For Bonaventure, the humility of God means that God comes to us in hiddenness. The humility of God is not, signs that say, hello, I'm God, look, worship me. God hides in the humble, ordinary things of our life in our world, and in a particular, explicit way in the person of Jesus. The incarnation, we can say, is an act of condescension, a descending, in which the inner movement of God becomes visible to the eye of faith. Francis himself, again, in his later admonition and exhortation, how does he describe the incarnation? The Word of God, the Word of the Father, left the divine riches and condescended, bent down. God bends down in love and hides in the ordinary things of our life and our world. Bonaventure viewed the whole of Christ's life as a mystery of humility. In a little work called the Lignum Vitae, the Tree of Life, he devoted a whole section to the humility of God. And he describes God as humble Savior, a humble God lying in a manger. He says, look at this humble God lying in a manger. What he brings out in that Tree of Life is that the lowliness of God, God's humility, is not a lowliness of his humanity, but of the divinity. The humble God lies in a manger. So what Bonaventure brings to us in the Lignum Vitae, in the life of Jesus, we have a clue as to who God is for us. God does not stand over creation as if God were playing chess, I know when I was growing up, when I was a little toddler in grammar school, and I went to Catholic grammar school, and we were on the fringes of the Baltimore Catechism. We always had to memorize, why did God make me? God made me to love him, serve him, know him, love him, serve him in this life, and so as to eternal life. And I always had this image of God as a male figure, grandfatherly, white beard, with a pipe sometimes. Up there, a spatial image of God, up there, And, if I were good, God would, reward me with candy or bubble gum or something, or going out to play. See, our image of God, I think, and it seems maybe this is just my image, I don't want to project anything here, but we have a spatial image of God, that God is up there as this male figure, ruling over creation, as playing chess or checkers, and while St. Peter is at the gates, ushering in the faithful souls type thing. And what Bonaventure is saying is that this God, he's like, skip that, hun, get rid of that image. God is infinite love and bent over in love. Bent over in love. God bends down to embrace us in love. And in embracing us and all of creation in love, God lifts us up into union with his life. So Bonaventure never tired of proclaiming, truly, you are a hidden God. You are a hidden God, a God with us. So for Bonaventure, the humility of God is most visibly shown to us in the cross of Jesus Christ. God visibly turned toward us in love. If you're having a bad day and you're not sure, like, where is God in all of this, am I in here in this universe alone? Bonaventure's like, look at the cross. There is the God of humble love who embraces you in love at this moment in this time. He says in his thought, the dereliction of the cross, that kind of scandal of the cross, is the most intense revelation of the divine humility. And the piercing of the human heart of Christ is the opening to humanity of the depth of divine love embodied in the love of the incarnate Son. In Bonaventure's thought, only the mystery of the cruciform love of the Son, that humble love, can lead us into the very heart of the mystery of God. If you have a chance, if you're ever in Washington, the Air and Space Museum has a wonderful planetarium. And we sat there in this planetarium looking at the new universe story, the world in which we live today. We are one of 100 billion galaxies. 100 billion galaxies, each galaxy with millions of stars. And our galaxy is a simple mid-sized one. And we, little planet Earth, is on an arm of the Milky Way. And so we see the vastness of the universe in which we live. And it's a mystery. How can God bring all of this into existence and love me personally in this universe? It's an evolutionary universe we live in. The new science today tells us that evolution is pretty much how we got here, how the universe itself has come to be, and we are still in the process of evolution. Evolution meaning change toward greater complexity. It's a world of chaos and complexity. Now, the science of chaos is actually pretty good news, because it means that things can break down, but new things can happen. New patterns of life can emerge out of old patterns. But, as scientists tell us today, nature seems to have the ability to self-organize. Within nature itself, there seems to be the ability to form, it's like, we don't need you humans, we can do it ourselves. You're interfering with us, actually. The physical world has the capacity for self-organization. Now, this has raised questions in the area of science and religion with regard to how God works in our world. Because if we are to read the scriptures, the book of Genesis, we know what God says, and God said, let it be done, and it was made, and God said, let there be light, and, light appeared. God parted the Red Seas. God raised the dead to life. God sent locusts, God sent manna in the desert. God does a lot of things in the Old Testament. That's the image of God that we inherit from our tradition. But the new science is telling us, oh, thanks. Yes, let it be done. God made it and it was made. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So on one hand, the biblical tradition says, well, God does it. God says, it's done, it's made, so be it. On the other hand, the new science is saying we have the capacity, within nature to do new things. So it's raising questions today. How does God work? How does God act in our lives, in our world? We know that the universe, yes, okay. Does God really give a demand to bring things into being? Does God intervene to put the parts together in some mysterious fashion? What is God doing? The same question that we're asking in terms of the physical world is the same question we ask in our own lives. When you're having a bad day, where is God in all this anyway? How come God doesn't fix this? You often hear these questions today. How come God doesn't make this world right? It's such a mess. God is God. Why can't God do this? Right? Well, various theologians are trying to understand this question today. The question of divine action. The German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, for example, claims that God withdraws himself, undergoes a type of kenosis to allow space within God's self so that creation can come into being. Okay? So we're trying to understand the self-organizing and evolutionary universe. So God, as Moltmann says, he uses this Jewish term, zinzum. He creates a space within himself so creation can come to be. God limits or withholds his power so that creation can come into being. One way of understanding the world in which we live. The Anglican priest John Polkinghorne claims that God takes a risk by creating. God, you might say, brings creation into being and gives it freedom and takes a risk in this. Risk-taking God. In a sense, we can say God may become part of the fate of the world. Well, whatever happens, happens. That's not a very comforting God, though. I think one of the concerns today, and it's a concern I always think about, is God has given freedom to creation. There's both freedom in creation and there's suffering. Those are the two aspects we're always dealing with. God seems to have brought a world into being that has the capacity to self-organize, but it also seems to have unlimited freedom. So the question is, does God take a risk in giving creation its autonomy and independence? Bonaventure offers a theology, I think, that's meaningful to understand God in an evolutionary world. For one thing, For Bonaventure, the fountain fullness of the Father within the Trinity is the same fountain fullness that brings creation into being. The Trinity itself, you might say, that fountain fullness of goodness, expresses itself outward and into the world and creation. Therefore, you might say, is a finite expression of the infinite goodness of God. Creation is not, an amusement of God, as if God had a boring day and said, oh, I think I'll make this little planet Earth, and see what that's like. Put a few people out there, see how they do. Creation is not radically separate from God. It is a free, limited expression of the infinite goodness of God. Creation is a finite expression of the infinite goodness of God. That means that creation is integrally related to a God of self-diffusive goodness. Creation is a limited expression of the infinite goodness of God. It's integrally related to God, who is self-diffusive by nature. So in this way, as a limited, you might say, as a finite expression of the infinite goodness of God, creation is caught up in the mystery of the generation of the Word from the Father. That means, here's the good news, here's the really good news. Creation, we might say, unfolds within the mystery of the Trinity. We're not alone. We are a finite expression of the infinite goodness of God. And therefore, creation is rooted in this goodness and emerges out of the innermost depths of the Trinitarian life. And therefore, we might say, God's humble love is with us, at the same time being infinite transcendent love. So, this means that the universe we live in shares in this mystery of the Trinity. And it's caught up in this mystery of self-transcendence and self-communication and creative love. If creation arises out of this fecundity of God, and it is an overflow of this fecundity, we can speak of a divine kenosis, whereby God communicates God's love to creation. Just as in the eternal life of God, the Father is turned toward the Son by the nature of the good, so too God is turned toward the world through the Word by nature of the good. God is turned toward us in the humility of love. I think for me, the way to understand God's humble love by which God is turned toward creation is, again, through Bonaventure's coincidence of opposites. God is infinite love and immanent love. And therefore, as a coincidence of opposites, God's transcendent nature of absolute goodness is God's immanence of self-giving love. It's precisely because God is this infinite love that God can be intimate love. And that's what God is simultaneously at the same time. Therefore, Bonaventure writes in chapter 6 of The Soul's Journey, as he looks at the mystery of Christ, God's power is his humility. God's strength is his weakness. God's greatness is his lowliness. That's a tremendous mystery. Because I think all too often we're looking only for a God of power, a God of strength, a God of greatness. What Bonaventure is saying is that power is hidden in humility. That strength is shown to us in weakness. That greatness is shown to us in lowliness. And the visibility of God's humility is the crucified Christ. But the thing is, of course, that God's humility, God's humble love is free. God could do whatever God wills. God is God. I guess if God wanted to right the wrongs of this world, God could. But God's greatness is God's humility. And that humility is love, and love is free. God is absolute freedom in love. And as freedom in love, God is faithful to creation without forcing it. So creation has, you might say, the ability to be itself, just as we have the capacity to be ourselves. God does not force us to be anything but what we are. So God is turned toward creation in humility and present to creation as humble, self-giving love or ultimate goodness. And it's by that very nature of God's humble love that God is faithful to creation. And we recall the words of Isaiah, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and therefore I am constant in my faithfulness to you. This is the commitment of God to us, to the other, to us who are the beloved of God. And God allows us to be ourselves precisely through the commitment of love. The theologian John Hodge notes, even in human relations, we are most responsive to others, whose love takes the shape of non-interference that gives us the slack to be ourselves. We feel most liberated and most alive in the presence of those who risk letting us be ourselves. In short, love does not manipulate or control, but rather seeks the best for the other. The God of the New Testament is a God of love. This is a God who allows us and creation to be ourselves while remaining faithful in love. So therefore, we can say the humble love of God comprises the inner force of the created universe. And we can have a self-organizing universe because God is faithful in love and present to us. And therefore we can live with chance, uncertainty, randomness, freedom, because God is with us in love. And it is this total self-giving and freedom for the sake of the good which both gives rise to being and is being. God's love is the basis of all that exists, and God is with us in that. So the bottom line is, take a chance, take a risk, go for it, because God is with us. The humility of God in a world of suffering. This is, I think, an important point for us today. A world of violence and suffering on so many levels. The level of abuse, the level of war, the level of illness. I'm always almost shocked by the incidence of cancer. The AIDS that permeates our world. You know, you look at Africa, Iraq, billions of people starving, dying. Where is God in all this? It's the age-old theodicy question. Why does a God of love allow a world to suffer? What is God doing? Couldn't God change this? Again, I think Bonaventure helps us come to a better idea here of the God we're in relationship with. For he shows to us, in the mystery of the cross, the mystery of God's unconditional love. And this mystery of love, the mystery of God's unconditional love, is the mystery of God's omnipotence and God's power. In the cross of Christ, the humility of God is expressed as the power of God to love in and through suffering and death. For Bonaventure, the centrality of the cross points to a God who is radically involved with the world and ultimately concerned for the world's wholeness and healing, its salvation. The cross for Bonaventure, we might say, is the love story between God and creation. Love is not a matter of words for Bonaventure. Love is act. Love is doing. Love is sharing the deepest center of one's life with another. Because that is who God is for us, sharing the deepest center of God's life with us. And I think that's why Jesus in the Gospels asked Peter, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? It's not that Peter says, oh, Jesus, do I have to say I'm sorry because Peter, are you willing to share the deepest center of your life with me? Are you willing to be part of the humility of love? In his soliloquy, one of his spiritual works, Bonaventure writes, he describes this unconditional outpouring love of God, the humble love of God. And he writes, Christ is waiting for you on the cross. His head is inclined for a kiss. His arms are spread out for an embrace. His hands open in a gesture of giving. His body is stretched in a position of total offering. His feet are attached and remain there for you. His side is open to let you in. With arms outstretched, the kiss and embrace of the crucified Christ to a sinful humanity, a broken world, is the fullest expression of the humility of God. I think Clare of Assisi got this. She really got this. Because for years, she gazed upon that cross of San Damiano, a God who was crucified and glorified. And she writes in that first letter to Agnes, this is a God who became poor, a God who has given all away in love for you and for me, a God who condescended, who has bent down in love to embrace us before all else. Look, gaze upon this mirror of the crucified Christ. See who God is for you. See who you are in relationship to this God. A God who is with us in a world of suffering, because a God who is faithful to us in the humility of love. Now, Bonaventure he was a medieval writer, and as all good medievalists maintained, the divine nature did not suffer. But in his humanity, Christ suffered physically and spiritually. And I've tried to come to a deeper understanding of the suffering of God that Bonaventure holds out to us. The theologian Gregory Baum can help us here. Baum states, suffering can have two meanings. On one hand, suffering can be due to a lack of something which belongs to our integrity. This type of suffering may be called suffering ex carentia, by deprivation, where we may lose our health, we may lose our family, our job, our friends. But there's another type of suffering. We may also suffer because our friends or family are vulnerable. And I'm sure we've all had that experience. Someone so close to you has had real tragedy in their lives. I was thinking as I was going over my notes of a neurosurgeon I worked with a number of years ago. He was an Italian neurosurgeon from Milan by the name of Mario Fiori, a delightful person. We always had many conversations about religious, and in the world of the laboratory, they were simply conversations, because it was all just nice ideas. And Mario would say to me, "Oh, I'm a deist. I'm not a personal believer." And we delighted in him being a deist and me being a Catholic. And in 1996, he wrote to me. He went back to Italy, and he wrote me that he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he asked, "Can you come to Italy, because the doctor has given me 2 years to live." And I couldn't make the trip at that time. And I could only get there 4 years later, in the year 2000, and Mario died in 1998. And I remember sitting with his wife, Morella, in their little apartment in Milan. And Morella was recounting to me the last days of Mario's life. He died at home, and at the end of his life, he kept asking Morella, "Why did God do this to me? What did I do wrong in my life that I had to suffer so much at the end?" Her suffering was so great, and I still remember sitting there with her. And all I could do is simply share in that suffering, because it had become my own suffering of Mario's loss at the time too. And I believe that this is how God suffers with us. God suffers not because God lacks something, but God shares the suffering of our lives. God suffers out of the fullness of God's love, ex abundantia. God loves us so much that when we are deprived of something, when we lose something in our lives, God shares in that suffering. And I think, therefore, that Bonaventure describes God's participation in suffering as a participation ex abundantia, out of the fountain fullness of God's love. God shares his love and shares in the pain and suffering of this world. In, again, that little work, The Tree of Life, Bonaventure writes, "See now, my soul, how he who is God, blessed above all things, is totally submerged in the waters of suffering." If we think we suffer without God, we're mistaken. For Bonaventure, the mystery of the cross is the mystery of poverty and humility, because here God does not possess but fully communicates the mystery of God, love in God's radical openness to and acceptance of who we are. Again, the cross is not about sin, it's about love. The cross is about love. That's why it stands at the center of our relationship with God. In the suffering and death of Jesus on the cross, the God of humble love fully reveals the depths of divine love as omnipotent love. God's power is the ability to persuade. That's what power means. God's power is not to manipulate or to control. God's power is shown to us in unconditional love in the cross of Christ. It is this love which transforms. This love changes death into life. And therefore, Bonaventure calls us into the mystery of the crucified Christ, because he calls us into the power of God's love. God's participation in the suffering of the world through compassionate love is God's humility, and God's humility is God's fidelity. I am with you always until the end of the world. So Bonaventure sees God's participation in the suffering of humanity in the form of compassionate love, sharing with us in the sufferings of our life, and yet always remaining infinite in love. The cross, as the sign of God's omnipotent love, tells us how we can do new things, how we can enter into new life. God shows power in weakness. God changes things in fragility. Places we don't normally look. Places we'd like to get away from. Brokenness, fragility, death, suffering. That's where we meet the God of humble love for Bonaventure. And that's what resurrection is about. Resurrection, suffering, and death. How is Jesus raised to that new life in God? Through the power of love. So God is in the midst of suffering, transforming it into new life. And we might say that the relationship of suffering and love is at the heart of the journey to God. Bonaventure calls us to union with the crucified God because he calls us into the power of compassionate love, the type of love where we can share in the sufferings of others. As he writes, there is no other path to God than through the burning love of the crucified. And in this respect, it is not knowledge that will lead us to God. It is love that leads us into the heart of God. Learn to love well, because suffering and love are the two arms of the embrace of God. The third area I just want to focus on is otherness and difference. Because I think Bonaventure's humility of God finds common ground with our search today in a postmodern world for a God who is a God of all peoples, otherness and difference. In his theology, Bonaventure allows us to explore the humility of God as the hidden presence of God in the other. And we see this notion of otherness and difference in, again, the Legenda Maior, that major legend of Francis. Bonaventure's story is framed by Francis's encounter with the crucified Christ. And we've heard this story, I'm sure, many times. Francis wanders into that broken down church at San Damiano. He meets this God of compassionate love in this figure of the crucified. And this meeting becomes the basis of encountering God in, you might say, the particularity of every other person, where the humility of God is expressed in the paradoxical form of hiddenness and revealedness. And we might say that this encounter with the other, this crucified God for Francis, changed him in the very core of his being. Basically, as I see it, as Francis encountered this God of humble love in the crucified Christ, something within him changed. Slowly, not automatically, but it changed. And it changed in this way. I think impressed by this love, because Bonaventure uses this language of Francis, is impressed by the compassionate love of God, Francis could no longer remain alone in his search for God. Meeting the God of compassionate love caused Francis to move from being an I-centered individual to a relational person. From an individual to a person. The word person can be derived from the Latin per sonare, to sound through, To be a person is one in whom an other sounds through in my life. An individual can be a self-contained, self-enclosed I. A person is one in whom there's an other. Jesus was a person because there was an other in his life empowering him to go out. And that's what I see with Francis. As Francis meets this God of compassionate love, the God of humble love, in the figure of the crucified, Francis becomes a man of true relationship. He discovers that he's no self apart from the other, including the tiny things of creation. And again, we know how he called all creatures, great and small, by the name of brother or sister, sister bird, sister cricket. These are not just pious terms. The word sister, brother, connotes relationality, a structure of relationship for Francis. Everything in creation spoke to Francis of God, and he found himself in a family. To meet the God of humble love, the God of compassionate love, is to move us into a sense of family in creation. And Francis realized this relationship again because of his relationship with Christ. So what we can say is, just as the Father is hidden in the Word, so too the humility of God is the hiddenness of the Father in the Word incarnate, and everything that expresses the Word incarnate in its distinct and unique way. Basically put, all of created reality expresses the humility of God. God is hidden in each and everything. Everything becomes incarnational. The love of God poured out into concrete reality, incarnation. And therefore, this notion of Christ, we come back to this notion of Christ is not just limited to this man, Jesus, but the notion of Christ is an all-encompassing reality for us. Love poured out into creation. And Bonaventure celebrates this mystery of Christ as the mystery of the Word incarnate in the diversity of creation. The more Francis entered into the mystery of Christ in his own life, the more he recognized Christ in the people and the creatures around him. He began to see Christ, as we've said now several times, in the irreproducible uniqueness of each person and creature, so that all things, each in its own way, led him to embrace Christ. The humble love of God made visible to us in the concrete, fragile things of our world. So God is not an abstract concept for Francis, but a living reality of love. And in Bonaventure's view, one who knows Christ knows this love, and one who knows this love knows each thing of creation as the expression of this love. Another way of saying this, all of creation is holy. We live imbued with the humility of God's love. Again, Bonaventure points out in that Life of Francis that this notion of Christ the center does not mean sameness, but unity and difference. In fact, the totality of Christ is found in the greatest diversity. Christ the center means unified diversity, since all things are created through the Word and are transformed in the transfiguration of Christ. So each person, each creature, expresses Christ the center by its own unique existence. Each person, each creature expresses the humility of God because God is hidden in that person or creature as humble love. So Bonaventure celebrates the gift of creation as the gift of God's self-communicative love. God is not a remote, self-sufficient being. God is the fecundity of goodness, and God seeks to share God's self with another. That's what the name God means, gift. God is gift, not some patriarchal figure. And therefore, Bonaventure's notion of God as this overflowing gift of humble love resonates with, you might say, some postmodern thinkers. And I would think here of Jean-Luc Marion in his book, God Without Being. Marion says, the name God does not mean being, but being as given. God is, insofar as God shares God's self. God is ecstatic. God stands outside God's self as gift. That is God. And that's Bonaventure's God. So I think Bonaventure helps in our contemporary understanding of God by transforming the remoteness of God's presence into the concrete love of neighbor and the things of creation. Because for Bonaventure, the word God denotes inexhaustible love, in which love of the other is love of God. And this love is nothing less than the humility of God's goodness shining through everything that exists, including all the little things of creation. So each person, everyone, as you turn on your televisions and watch the people of Iraq and the people of Liberia and the people of Indonesia, there is the humility of God as love. There is the expression of God's goodness. What are we doing with our freedom? Everything for Bonaventure, from dust to stars to human persons, speaks God. You want to know who God is? Stand in the midst of creation. Because God speaks God's self in the manifold variety of creation. The senses, therefore, are very important to know a God of humble love. How do we come to know this God of humble love? Okay, we said the senses. We have the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the heart. But for Bonaventure, we must be on the path to contemplation. And we spoke of this last night a little bit. Contemplation, we might say, is a penetrating vision that gets to the truth of reality. Franciscan spirituality takes this concrete world with its brokenness, its fragility, its weakness, every aspect of it, it's taken seriously. We are called to contuit. We spoke of this last night. To look into, to see more deeply. How can we see more deeply the truth of God's humble presence in our lives and our world? Well, here's the journey. Poverty, prayer. I think all too often in a world that's complex and changing, we're all too often caught up within ourselves. We're stuffed with our thoughts, our worries, our cares, our anxieties. I feel like Francis naming these. We're all wrapped up. So the journey to God is all about letting go. Poverty is a stripping away, you might say, to allow God in. Poverty allows us to be free so that our heart may be recentered in God. I think that's what chapter 7 of the soul's journey into God is about. When we talk about, that movement into a crucified Christ as the path to contemplation, we're okay with the first few chapters, and we're like, ooh, what is he talking about there? I think what he's really saying is this letting go, becoming free, so that your heart may be centered in God, so that you may become compassionate in love. It's a Passover into the dominance of God's grace. And in that last portion of the soul's journey, Bonaventure writes, let us die and enter into this God. And with Philip, let us say, it is enough for us. You are the God of my heart, the God who is my rock and my portion forever. When your heart is recentered in God, you begin to see the world with new vision, because you begin to see with the eyes of the heart. We can look at chapter 7 of the soul's journey into God in tandem with chapter 13 of the Legenda Major, the life of Francis, because these two works fit together. And what do we find after Francis received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ? He didn't go off and say, ta-da, I've reached the heights of contemplation, poor you. You know, I have been chosen, I have been graced by God. Rather, Bonaventure writes, he descended the mountain, marked with the wounds of Christ, and thirsted for the salvation of all people. As we move into a God of compassionate love, a God of humble, self-giving love, and we begin to see the world in which we live, we begin to see our own lives as gifts. We thirst for justice and peace. We thirst for unity in our world. So for Francis, the other is where he began to encounter God, because his heart became recentered in God. His world became an enfraternization, a community of brothers and sisters of all that exists because of Christ, the center in whom the humble love of God dwells. So, what does this mean for us today, very briefly? First of all, the humble God is not a remote or disinterested God. If you think you can run away from God or escape God, or God is not watching you, or God is not with you, you're mistaken. Sorry, but it's just the way it is. The God of infinite love is intimately present with you, even in those dark moments, those desolate moments, those moments when it seems like all has gone awry. Because this humble God is a relational God. And God is goodness. The relationality of God is such that God communicates that God's love and gives this love completely to us, sharing this humble love. So God bends over, continues to bend over, is bent over as we sit here, bent over in love for each one of you, for me, for all of creation, for the world in which we live, for the world with its suffering and its violence, with its abuses, with its pains and its darkness. God is bent over in love and embracing it, this tiny, fragile creation, bringing it into unity with his divine nature in and through the humanity of Christ. We might say that incarnation is all about God's involved goodness. God is involved with us. And therefore, we live in a world that's meaningful and purposeful. God cares for this world. Creation has a goal, and this goal is centered in Christ. Therefore, God, we might say, is intimately united to the world, yet transcendent in love, luring it without forcing it into a new future of radical transformation in love. You know, I have a point here from Margaret Wheatley. She has that wonderful book, Leadership and the New Science. And too often we can lose sight of God in our lives, and we become, again, very fearful, worried. Margaret Wheatley says how she was one day at a playground with her little child. And children are wonderful, you know, good exemplars. And her little son was on the teetotaler, you know, those Seesaws, yeah. And up he went and down he went, or then he went on the swings and he's swinging and he wants to swing so high he could turn around. Children are free and they love spontaneity. They love the adventure. They want to take the risk. What happens when we get older? We're afraid to go on that seesaw because we can fall and break a bone, We're afraid to go on that swing because we might break it. No, I'm not kidding. Basically, what Margaret calls us to is to live in the playfulness of chance, to live in spontaneity, creativity. Do not be afraid to risk. Do not be afraid of change, of uncertainty, because we live in relationship to a God of humble love, a God who is with us in love and yet infinitely luring us in love. So again, I would say for us, the example of God's humble love is shown to us in the cross of Christ. And again, I come back to Claire, because I think she got it. Gaze upon this mystery of who God is for us. And not only gaze, but become what you love. That's the key here. It is not simply that God loves us with compassionate love. We are to become vessels of compassionate love. We are to become what we love. That's why there's freedom in creation. That's why God doesn't force us, so that we may choose to love freely, to love compassionately. And we might say we are called to love like the crucified Christ. We are called to be embraces of love for others, for our sisters and brothers. In Bonaventure's view, if we love a poor and humble God, then we are to become poor and humble. This means a God-centered life that makes space within ourselves to receive the other, to live in the humility of God's love. To live with a crucified Christ is to live with open arms, to allow those we would otherwise reject, to allow those who may be lepers to us, to make space within ourselves so that they may enter in to our lives. This is what I think Francis saw. He saw God's goodness shining in the other, and he made space within himself to allow that other to enter in. Not only to embrace the other, but to allow the other to embrace him. This is the path of letting go for the sake of greater unity. This is what God's humble love shows us in the crucified Christ and what we are called to be. So prayer and contemplation, to see and to love, is to live in a God of humble love, a God who dwells in the brokenness of our lives, a God who dwells in the other who are our neighbors, the ones who are different from us. Living in relationship to a humble love should cause us to look at concrete reality more deeply, because this is where the goodness of God is hidden. Francis himself says in that letter to the order, look at the humility of God and pour yourselves out for him. Give yourselves totally to him who has given himself totally to you. Bonaventure writes in his soul's journey in the chapter 1, any person who's not illumined by such great splendor in created things is blind. Anyone who is not awakened by such great outcries is deaf. Anyone who is not led by such efforts to give praise to God is mute. Anyone who does not turn to the first principle as a result of such signs is a fool. Boy, those are pretty harsh words. Therefore, open your eyes, alert your spiritual ears, unlock your lips, apply your heart, so that in all creatures you may see, hear, praise, love, adore, magnify, and honor your God, lest the entire world rise up against you. If your senses are deadened, you are a fool and blind to the humility of God. So we are called to live in the humility of God by learning to bend over in love. We are called to a life of descending solidarity with all of creation. Because when we can get rid of whatever it is that prevents us from loving the other, then we can recognize that the primordial mystery of love, that is the source of my neighbor, the source of my sister and brother, is the source of my life as well. And this is the common ground of our life together. In his final lectures on that 6 days of creation, Bonaventure described the crucified Christ as the center of all history, all time, of the whole universe. In the cross, God bends down in love for every single person and creature, and through suffering and death, leads each one into the dance of the Trinity. Only one who lives in the crucified God can know the humility of God. And one who knows the humility of God's love knows the power which moves the sun and the other stars, and which can bring justice and peace to our world. Thank you.